Hey, everybody, and welcome to Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. It is episode 122 of the podcast, and we are finally here. It's draft week, baby. Let's go. Excited to get it going. Really excited because the Florida Panthers are now the Stanley Cup champions, and we can now focus on the draft completely. And that's what we're going to do on today's episode. We're going to get you ready for what will happen on Friday. A lot can change between now and then. We record this on Tuesday morning. But there is a lot to get to and a lot more that we are going to cover for you today. We've got a lengthy Q&A with a lot of different fan questions, which will help us kind of get through some of the most important topics of this draft, the things that you guys want to know most about. We're also going to provide some updates here in the early portion of the show about some of the news that's come out in the last week that may or may not affect the draft and certainly the draft order and different things of that nature. But as I mentioned, a lot can change. Now that the Stanley Cup is over, we expect a lot more movement. There could be a lot more trades. There could be a lot more, talk of picks moving here and there. So there's a lot to kind of get through on today's show. We're going to do our best to do it quickly, concisely, and then I got to get on a plane to get over to Vegas because Flo Hockey will be there providing coverage throughout, and I wanted to let you know about that before we get started with the pod. All this week, we'll have plenty more draft content. A new mock draft will be coming out because there have been some movement there. Also, we will have a draft notebook on the day of the draft. And then, of course, as we do each year, live pick-by-pick analysis of the first round. I will give you a little bit of information on the players, then also on the team fit and some thoughts on the pick in general. And you will be able to see that on draft night on night one. On day two, you will see a draft grades where we grade the entire draft class. A look ahead to the 2025 NHL draft because, of course, as soon as one draft is over, you got to start the next one, and we'll keep moving on. So I want to make sure that you are following us on FloHockey.tv. That's where all that content will be, but you can also follow us across social media platforms. Flo Hockey, at Flo Hockey across most, at Flo Hockey TV on TikTok. We will have player interviews. We will have on-site reporting. We will have so much fun stuff and whatever hijinks we can possibly get into in Vegas. Looking forward to getting down there. I'll be down there with Liz Child and Lucas Wiseman from Flo Hockey. We will have a full team down there. We will be giving you the best coverage we possibly can. And of course, that live draft analysis that you crave, we will be able to give it to you on FloHockey.tv. So make sure you are bookmarking our NHL draft coverage. Also, please subscribe, rate, review, leave a comment on this podcast. It does help us get out there. It's been obviously a more popular show in the last few weeks as we've gotten ready for the NHL draft, and we've had some news and we've had some different updates and different analysis. And if you enjoy this podcast, it really does help. I can't stress this enough. It really does help. If you've really enjoyed this, please do leave a kind rating and review on your audio app of choice. And as always, you can also comment on our YouTube page because this podcast is simulcast on the YouTube page and on FloHockey.tv. So plenty there. So please follow our coverage. We are going to have a blast doing it. Can't wait to get down to Vegas. And as I mentioned, I'll be recording this podcast and pretty much getting on a plane to go do that. So anyway, before we get into the draft of it all, I do want to talk a little bit about the Florida Panthers and the Stanley Cup Finals and the lessons that you can take from Stanley Cup champion teams. And if there's one thing that we can see about the Florida Panthers and about the job that Bill Zito did building this team up and also, coming in after Dale Talon, who made some significant moves and obviously some significant draft picks before this team won the Stanley Cup later on, I think, this is an interesting dynamic. So every time you talk to scouts anymore, they're not just talking about the players that they want, that they believe in, that they think are going to be good players. They want players that they think will help them win a Stanley Cup. Now you say, well, that's everybody, right? It's really hard to find those kinds of players, and it's really hard to see where we go. And, I would say that one of the things that struck me about this Stanley Cup championship was the size of the team. And as you look at it, according to Elite Prospects roster, the average size of the Florida Panthers is 6'1", 198 pounds. They had each defenseman that played in the Stanley Cup final and in Game 7 was 6 foot or taller. every forward except for 3 was over 6 feet. And then their goaltenders were 6'2" and 6'6". So basically they follow that model of, the bigger team. You also look at how Florida plays, and how they play is fast, but also physical. And they weren't as fast as Edmonton, but they were able to play a heavy game. That forecheck was outstanding in Game 7. And you see the guys that are in there, and you look at the players that they have, and it's not just Barkov and Tkachuk and Verhaeghe, the offensive style guys. I thought in Game 7, one of the best players on the ice the entire night was Eetu Luostarinen, and he was everywhere. That forecheck, and this is a big player, not a premium guy, not the kind of player that you take in the first round, not a superstar player, but you need guys like him to win. And you see even Kyle Poso, who was a first-round pick back in the day, he had to adjust his game over the years from being an offensive talent to more of a defensive fourth-line guy, and he played an effective game as well. Then there are the smaller guys. Like Ryan Lomberg is not a big guy, but he's a very physical, involved, forechecking player that plays that attacking style. So players like that, there will always be a place for. And it just strikes you, these conversations that you have with scouts, that I have with scouts, invariably is coming back to that size conversation. Another thing that's interesting about the Florida Panthers is you look at this team and it is not built through the draft. It is not built through the draft. They have their premier guys, the number 1 pick, Aaron Ekblad, a number 3 pick in Alexander Barkov, or number 2 pick in Alexander Barkov. You have, the Anton Lundell, Dmitry Kulikov, who was a Florida Panthers draft pick, but went away for a while and then came back. So we don't necessarily, I don't know if you count him as a homegrown talent, given that he was acquired after the fact and not acquired through the draft. So only a few players that played in the Stanley Cup final that were drafted by the Florida Panthers, coming on the heels of a Stanley Cup where the Vegas Golden Knights had Nick Hague and maybe 1 or 2 other players that played in the Stanley Cup final that they were drafted and or signed as undrafted free agents by that team. Think of Zach Whitecloud. So there are many ways to build a Stanley Cup champion, but you still want to try to find those pieces in the draft. And that's why I think a lot of teams are going to be looking at those bigger players. And you say, if I'm looking at a player like a Cole Hudson, who's a smaller defenseman, a 5'10" defenseman, who has tremendous offensive upside, or a guy like Charlie Ellick, who's 6'3" and is a much more defensively capable player and a physical guy and then plays that heavier game. I think that's why you're seeing Charlie Ellick, who doesn't have a great offensive upside, well ahead of a player like Cole Hudson, who has a strong offensive upside. The size factor does matter to teams, and I think it will continue to, even as they go along. But the thing that I'll say in closing is that the Florida Panthers did all of the work that they had to do to make this team. And while drafting through or building through the draft is certainly a method that, like, you can't win without those top picks, it feels like, except Vegas kind of did, even though they went out and acquired guys like Jack Eichel and the premium talents like that. But most teams, Florida is now among them. And you think back to Colorado, you think back to some of those other teams where they had those high picks. St. Louis was a team that didn't have that top 3, top 4 guy that was on their roster. But a lot of teams have these lottery wins. So you do have to go through that pain to get that high draft pick, to get those cornerstone players. The Florida Panthers do not do this without Alexander Barkov, who is the cornerstone of their franchise. And it's the same thing when we see, Macklin Celebrini come, that is the key moment. I've said it many times. I feel like Macklin Celebrini, the San Jose Sharks winning the draft lottery, was probably the most significant day in that franchise's history beyond its founding, because of the fact that he can be that foundational piece, as Marleau was before him, but in a way that, even more pronounced now with the opportunity to build. So great Stanley Cup final. It's the kind of series that makes you remember, if you forget, I don't know if you do, but remember how great this sport is and why we love it and why we love the Stanley Cup final. So absolutely outstanding stuff in that. All right, let's get to the NHL draft. That's why we're here. That's what we're going to talk about. We are going to have the picks on June 28th and June 29th at the Sphere in Las Vegas. It is the last in-person draft. It is the last time for many of us to gather in the same place. I think that the draft will look differently. I still think it's going to be a lot of people on site, but I don't know if I'll be one of them. We'll see where we go. We'll see what happens and what the draft looks like going forward as it goes to that more NFL style where everybody's in their own war rooms. And the more you talk to people, I think the more NHL teams have really grown comfortable with that option. They like the fact that nobody can sneak in and listen to what they're saying over there. All right, so let's get to the draft news that is important for coming up. The big story in the prospect world this week, Matvei Mitkov, just minutes before we went on air, was formally released from his contract by SKA St. Petersburg or SKA St. Petersburg. He will be joining the Philadelphia Flyers ahead of next season. Very interesting situation. And also, how does it impact things for the Flyers going forward? Well, Philadelphia has a high pick, and when you have a high pick, we talk about the different guys, Matvei Mitkov and Cutter Gauthier looked like they were going to be guys that could kind of be in that cornerstone, those building blocks. And now it's really just Mitkov. So at number 12, Philadelphia has a chance to land in a premier player. Danny Briere in his recent pre-draft press conference, kind of hinted that the Phillies probably going to be looking at centers. And you think about the guys that'll be there, Consta Helenius, maybe you get lucky and Berkly Catton still floating around there. I think those are two guys that they'll target with that potential. I think those are the two guys most likely to be there. And it allows them to get another high skill player into that system, although neither very big. And of course, Matvei Mitkov is not very big either. So that's certainly something that will weigh on teams, and they'll have to make some decisions, or Philly will have to make some decisions about, exactly how they're going to go about the team building. There are going to be some really good defensemen available there still. How does that jive with what they're doing? Could they afford to get some more players in there? I think they absolutely could, to try and to continue to add to the blue line if those are the better players available. If you think that there's a Yakimchuk or a Parekh that's there and you like that, what they bring to the table, I think that that's absolutely something that we'll want to see what Philly is going to do. I think it creates a bit of a complication for them, but Michkov's arrival doesn't really change anything timeline wise. It doesn't really materially change the Flyers' competitiveness. Do I think Mitkov will be a solid player next year? I do. I think that he'll be able to play NHL minutes. I think he'll be able to play on the power play. And I think that, it'll be an interesting dynamic between him and John Tortorella. But as hard as people are on the way that John Tortorella coaches, I think that he understands how important this prospect is to the future of the franchise. I think he also understands in general, how to manage that. And then also to make sure that he's doing right by the organization. I think that that's been something that Tortorella has towed that line in Philly. If it's usually the veteran players that are getting, the harsher treatment, as you see like with Sean Couturier last year. So I think, the marriage between Torts and Mitkov will be interesting, but I don't think it'll be one that John Tortorella is actively harming. The one thing I will say too about Mitkov is that, as is always the case, SKA will retain his rights. So that puts Philly in a bit of a bind, somewhat, not really, but there's always, if they have to send Mitkov to the AHL and that's not something he's willing to do, he has that escape route, which is one of the things that I think is part of what we call the new Russian factor. It's not that the player is there's certain things about character and other things like that based on stereotypes or whatever. It's actually about the fact is they have leverage and more than the average player, because they can go make a decent salary in the KHL. But Mitkov coming to the Flyers, super, super exciting. I had one reader ask me, what if I knew that Mitkov would get out of his contract, which still had 2 more years on it after this one, after this last season, if I thought he would go higher. And I don't think so. I don't necessarily think so. He could have gone higher. He would have been on my board. He was number 4 behind both Adam Fantilli and Leo Carlsson. But anybody that's followed my work for a long time knows that I think Matvei Mitkov is a hockey genius. I think that he is an exceptional player. The reason that those 2 other guys are ahead of him, size, versatility. and then also the fact that both of them could potentially be centers, whereas Mitkov will never be a center, and will always be a scoring winger. So very excited to see him in the NHL very soon. The other news this week, Boston Bruins did finally move Linus Ullmark. It seemed like everybody knew that would happen, but what would they get back? And they got back, among other things, a first-round draft pick in this year's draft, the 25th overall pick. So the Boston Bruins get they get out of their goaltending situation, which was not going to be long-term, with Jeremy Swayman needing a new contract. Swayman kind of took over the net from Ullmark. He's the younger player. It makes all the sense in the world. They did get Joonas Korpisalo back with some salary retained by Ottawa, which is helpful. They do have Brandon Bussey in their system. I like Brandon Bussey an awful lot. I think that he's got a chance to be, a strong number two to Swayman there. So we'll see if he gets much run, depending on what happens with Korpisalo. But that, Now the Bruins are back in the mix. So that'll be one of the reasons why we have a new mock draft, is we have a new team in the first round, and we'll certainly hope to wait out some more trades and have updates on Wednesday or Thursday with a mock draft with whatever movement we see. So if you are a Boston Bruins fan, I did want to give you some idea of what players could be available at number 25, which is now where the Bruins pick. And the Bruins have only had one first-round pick in the last 4 drafts. And so getting this pick back in a draft that I think has some quality to it, that has a number of different positions that they can address, is good. So the guys that I have kind of circled that I think fit Boston's profile and also are potentially going to be there in that range. Sasha Boisvert from the Muskegon Lumberjacks, a 6'2", two-way center, good scoring ability. Just really like what he brings to the table. He's going to the University of North Dakota next year. Liam Greentree from the Windsor Spitfires. He's a big scoring winger, not the best skater, but incredibly intelligent with the puck on his stick, and scored a ton of points for Windsor this season. Some of the defensemen that are available, Charlie Ellick, EJ Emery, both could potentially be there at number 25. Guys with size, athleticism, mobility, really good skaters, both strong defensively. So as Boston continues to build up a prospect pool that's a little bit on the shallow side, those are some of the guys that will be available. Another player I wanted to talk about as we've got news, Elliot Friedman reported on 32 Thoughts, obviously one of the premier podcasts in the sport, that Rutger McGroarty and the Winnipeg Jets appear headed towards a trade. And McGroarty was the 14th overall pick 2 years ago, captain Team USA to the World Juniors this past year. He had announced that he's going to return to Winnipeg for his junior season, which honestly was not a huge shock to me. However, we get a little more detail now, and it sounds like, McGroarty was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't going to be, traded, or wasn't going to be signed and then put into the NHL right away and have an opportunity to compete for a roster spot right away. And there's a couple reasons that players want to do that. For one, it burns that first year off their entry-level contract. And two, it just gives them that opportunity to be an NHL player right away and to see what it's all about. I think the position that Winnipeg was in as a team, fighting for the playoffs, trying to keep things going, and they had really, found a cohesiveness under Rick Bowness and different things like that. It would have been hard for McGroarty to get in there. It would have been hard for him to find playing time. I think the thing about him is he had a tremendous season at Michigan, really, a solid World Juniors where he was playing through injury, and then, helped Michigan get to another Frozen Four. Was he going to be ready to make an impact for the Jets? I'm not so sure. And the thing is with Winnipeg's situation, we talk about the location all the time, but I think the other thing is their AHL team is also in Winnipeg. And if you have the choice between Ann Arbor, Michigan, playing for one of the premier college programs in the country with your friends, with, you've got roots kind of there a little bit, or going to play for the AHL team in an NHL market where, you're not really getting that same level of attention and fan support and whatever else. I think that the decision to go back to Michigan isn't all that bad. But now the interesting thing is if McGroarty is going to be traded, will he be traded for a draft pick? Will he be traded for another prospect? And the thing is, I think it's going to be very difficult for Winnipeg to get, 14th overall or higher for McGroarty straight up. In fact, so you're not going to get the equal value of your draft pick, which I think is probably really frustrating for Jets fans and frustrating for the Jets. But also, you're in this untenable situation where what if McGroarty decides to wait 2 more years and then he can go to free agency? That is the leverage that a player is using here. And, the fact is that Winnipeg has very rarely put a player directly from their draft class into the NHL. Kyle Connor played in the AHL briefly. Brad Lambert was there all of last season. They had Chibrikov there as well. Like they have their younger guys. They play in the AHL. It's part of their development structure. While that may work for a lot of players when we're talking about these top 15 picks, these guys that have that other option, well, then you see them going other ways. And I will say that Rutger McGroarty, one of his best friends, is Cutter Gauthier, who obviously forced a trade out of Florida. So it's happening with a little bit more regularity. And we got a question about this later in the show. We've actually got a lot of questions about McGroarty later in the show. So we're going to leave the rest of that for then so I can answer your questions. But very interesting situation for the Jets. Lastly, before we get into the Q&A, Buffalo and New Jersey, it still seems like there's at least the potential they can move those picks, their first round picks. I think Buffalo, to me, those are the trades that might not happen until right before they're due to pick. Teams are going to want to see how the top 7 shakes out, top 8 shakes out before they make any moves to get to those picks. There's still a high amount of value on the picks that both of those teams have. There is, the fact that New Jersey's at 10 and Buffalo is at 11. You can get one of the premier talents of this draft class. You can get one of the top players. You can get a difference-making prospect. If you have a roster player or somebody that, that both or either of Buffalo or New Jersey thinks can help them immediately, you have a real opportunity to grab it, to get a real solid pick, but then also, what are you willing to give up? And I don't think either Buffalo or New Jersey should make a move for the sake of making a move unless it's going to make them materially better, because even if they don't make that, if they don't make a trade, they have an opportunity to land a premium prospect, which is still a very valuable thing for both of those teams. All right. So the questions that we got today, as we get into the question and answer period, the questions that we have here are really good in terms of driving the conversation forward on a number of these topics, and then also on the top of the draft. We're going to focus a lot on the top of the draft, but we have some questions about the second round, sleepers, different things like that, just names for you to know as you head in. And so, I think that we'll just kind of go. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to get to them as quickly as I can. Like I said, I got to hop a flight and get over to Vegas and let this thing start happening for real. But I think that this is going to be a really fun draft to follow, and hopefully these answers will help you prepare even a little bit better than you already have. Because if you're listening to this podcast, odds are you care about the draft, and well, let's see how much. All right, our first question today comes from Charger J, and this question is: how would you rate this overall draft in terms of weak, average, strong, or very strong? I think it's, to me, I've said this a lot lately. I think a lot of drafts are defined by the top of the draft. Who are the players at the very top? And if we're talking about that, it's a strong top 15. I think having the number of defensemen that we have, having the number of forwards, the fact that Macklin Celebrini is a quality, an elite first overall pick option, that changes things. As we get past that, the rest of the draft goes back to average. And that's pretty much every draft. You look the value of those picks from the first half of the second half of the first round, going into the next phase of the draft, they're pretty much indistinguishable. The players in those ranges are going to be, less of a sure thing, a little bit more on the flawed side, a little more work that needs to be done. You're still able to find those gems. You're still able to get lucky in the mid rounds. That will be the case for this draft, as it is for most. I think that, like I said, to me, this comes back to being an average draft, which is kind of all of them. I think you go back to the McDavid year, a little bit higher, higher on that one. You go back to the Jack Hughes year, that was a pretty solid one too. But these are there's enough premium talent here for me to say that this is an above average. So not quite strong, but an above average year in terms of what we have in that first round. All right, our next one comes from Jesse. And Jesse asks, what's the latest on Anaheim? How does that change if they trade Zegras before the draft? Well, the answer is that we don't have a ton of info on Anaheim, and that's the way Anaheim likes it. I think a lot of us are guessing. I'm certainly guessing in terms of what they're going to do. The Zegras situation is an interesting one because I think that, just to make it clear, I don't think that Anaheim is actively shopping him. I just think that if there's a package that comes along, they will be able to make that trade. I just think that there's enough smoke there in terms of where the team is going and how certain players fit into the future of that team. The other thing is that I think that, the Zegras trade value is kind of low. It's not low, but it's lower than it would have been, a year ago at this time. Didn't have a really great season. Didn't really seem to fit all that well with where Anaheim was going. But in terms of what I think Anaheim will do, I think we're all guessing, but we're all guessing largely the same thing, which probably means it's going to go in a complete opposite direction because a lot of us were guessing Adam Fantilli last year and they picked Leo Carlsson. But I think Anton Salayev, the buzz is still very much that he's going to be a high pick, that teams believe in what he is and what he'll be. There are definitely concerns about overall offensive upside, but the defensive game, the physicality, the size, the mobility, all present a foundation of a high-end NHL defenseman that will play a lot of minutes. And he's a little different than what they have in the system. You look at there's a lot of good young defensemen in the system, but you put Anton Salayev and his projection would be that he'd be ahead of most of what they have now, if not all of what they have now, with the exception being potentially Pavel Mintyukov. So that is, a place where Anaheim could potentially make the largest dent in their operation and in their growth by landing a player like him. So we'll see. Pat Verbeek likes to throw curveballs, and he just may on the draft floor. Could Demidov be in the mix? Certainly could. They were at that camp in Florida, so certainly could be in the mix there. All right, let's move on to our next question. This one comes from Joe. And Joe says, it seems like a lot of teams are shopping picks. So how many top 15 picks do you actually think get traded? Good question, Joe. My guess is that it'll be one. And I think it'll be either New Jersey or Buffalo's. I think everybody else will probably stand pat. I don't see any other team really taking off. It would take something substantial to move those picks. I think, the Sabres are feeling the heat. They want to get more competitive quicker. I think the same is true of New Jersey. They want to make sure that they're making the playoffs next year. They want to make sure they're going a little bit further. What gets you that player? What kind of players get you there? And so I wish I could tell you who I thought would be good trading partners for them, but I got to keep my focus on the players that are going to get picked as opposed to the players that are going to get traded. All right, our next question comes from JP. And JP asks, who takes Demidov and what's the likelihood he falls out of the top 5? Well, we certainly saw last year that, that Matvei Mitkov fell to 7. He wasn't even the first Russian taken last year. Dmitry Simashev was. And you can argue whether or not that was the right choice by Arizona, now Utah. However, what I think about Demidov is interesting because I think the conversation in the public is not matching the conversation that's being had by NHL scouts. And I think it's interesting because the conversation that NHL scouts have about Demidov are not just about the skill. Nobody denies the skill. Nobody denies the offensive capability. Nobody denies, the fact that there's a chance to have a premium winger. But I talked last week that there was comfort or more comfort that Demidov was going to come over immediately. He said things a little bit inconsistently with the media, and he said things a little bit inconsistently with NHL teams as well. So the first inclination, last week's podcast was very early on in that camp, and as the week progressed, more skepticism came out in terms of, is he going to be a top, like, is it locked down that he's coming over next year? The other conversation that I've had, and certainly, I think is worth having, is if, depending on what his usage is next year in the KHL, like if he ends up playing limited minutes for Ska, if he ends up going back to the MHL, it's a real concern. And just for his development, but also for his NHL timeline. And then you're talking about, okay, well, if he plays through his KHL season next year with his contract, what happens after that? Where do you go from there? Because will he take AHL time? And that's just one of those things that teams are not completely sure about. And I think that the fact is that Ska is one of the most powerful clubs in international hockey. They have a lot of money. They can be persuasive. There's political arms that can be moved as well. And that's still a concern, even though we just saw Matvei Mitkov get released. And some might say, well, that means obviously Ska is going to let their next best prospect go. I don't know if that's the case. I actually think that Mitchkov's signing makes it a little more complicated in the Demidov race. So to get to your question of whether or not he slips out of the top 5, I don't think he does, but I'm not 100% going to say no. I think that both Columbus, I think really even Anaheim, Columbus, Philly, Chicago is having the conversation still. I still believe they're going to go defenseman over wing, but that doesn't mean that that's for sure. So there's options for him, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each of those teams can make a compelling case to take the player. Anaheim might fail. We are really well insulated. We don't need him right away. If things go south, we'll be fine. We have enough prospects. We have enough guys on NHL timelines that are going to be soon. Columbus, we can make a big splash here. We can, we've got a new regime. Let's make this big splash. But they can also make a splash with a Cayden Lindstrom. And Montreal has a desire for forward. The thing is they have Nick Bobrov on their scout, running their scouting. Nick Bobrov, if anybody knows SKA, it's him. Worked there, has been on the ground there, understands the machinations of all that. So if they pass on him, the interesting thing is if they pass on him, where does he go next? Does Utah want to add a third Russian after taking 2 in the first round last year? Does Ottawa jump on that with the potential risk and also the fact that you might not always be the most palatable place to re-sign at for players that are not Canadian? That's another thing. If you are Seattle, you have a real need at D, but can you pass on that forward? Those are the things that, like, there could be a little bit of a tumble if he doesn't go to those top 5 teams. So I'm just saying that not everybody is sold that he is going to be the elite winger that a lot of people are projecting him to be. I had him 3rd on my board. I think he's a star. Okay. I think he's going to be a star, but I always make this case. I am picking players on a list. My job is not on the line if I put him 3rd. If I'm an NHL general manager, I make that pick and all of a sudden he signs and we're not going to see him for 4 years, I'm in trouble. And so the other thing is too, and don't discount this, the decision makers, the guys that make the final decision on these picks, have largely not seen him play live hockey since the Hlinka Gretzky Cup 2 years ago. And that is not a small thing. Yeah, the advancements in video, yeah, we can see players. They want to be able to see those players live. They want to get a full picture of that player. And I think that will weigh heavily on the decisions to draft Demidov. I think he's an exceptional talent. I think that any team that picks him is going to have a future star, but they are also going to have some questions that will need to be answered later on. All right. Great question, JP. Thank you for that. Next up comes from Simon, and Simon asks, how does Lindstrom's injury impact his rankings for teams? For example, on my own scouting couch, I have him around third best prospect. But because of injuries, I believe I'd be tempted to pick guys like Iginla and Seneca ahead of him. Can NHL teams see risks and drop him too? Really good question. And we talked a bit about, coming out of the combine, scouts were less concerned about his injury history. They felt like some teams felt like it wasn't going to be a lingering issue, that it was something he was going to be able to work through. Other teams aren't as certain. Basically the issue is there's been, questions about the health of Lindstrom's back. He has been skating. He has been working out. He did a number of drills at the combine, including pull-ups. And, so he's trying to show that the back is in good health. All the teams got medical reports. All the teams were able to see kind of what's up, and were able to give those to their medical teams and get their own interpretations. And from what I've heard, it's been mixed in terms of what that looks like. It's not, I can't say definitively that teams are moving Lindstrom down because of it, but I do think that he's another guy that's a little bit more of a wild card, just because when you play physical, when you're big, and even though you're young, back injuries just scare teams. And with that, they are definitely monitoring that situation. And the thing is when you're picking in that top 5, you are trying to mitigate some amount of risk. But I do think that teams are going to still swing on the talent, the upside, the size, the speed, and that will be helpful to them. All right. Our next one comes from a podcast favorite, Bill Armstrong's Burner. And Bill Armstrong, of course, the GM of the now Utah Hockey Club. And he's asking, who are we taking at 6? And just to be clear, I don't think this is really Bill. But either way, just want to make sure. Don't want to have any troubles with the new Utah club. I think for Utah, they have a lot of options. And I think, you look back to the last year, I just mentioned, if let's say Demidov is there at 6, I don't necessarily think that that's a pick they're going to make. It gives them, now 3 potential, what are we going to get out of our Russian players, like that creates a little bit of mystery. I think that what will be available there at 6 will be more palatable. I think they can go defense. I think they can go forward. I think on the last mock draft, putting Beckett Seneca with them is something that, I think is absolutely possible. Seneca's on the rise. He is a guy that a lot of teams like, that teams are fascinated by and believe that he can be a top pick and a contributor in the near future. And he's, almost 6'3". He's got high skill. He's a scorer, had a great second half, put a lot together. And, I think that that's an option for them. I don't think I wouldn't put it past him to say, hey, like we like Teagan. We like the way that he plays. We like the what he can bring to the table. I think any of the defensemen, you look at Sam Dickinson, you look at Carter Yakimchuk, you look at Zeev Buium, who is a guy that's going to move the needle for them on the back end? I like Dmitry Simashev, who they picked last year. I think that he's going to be more capable on the defensive side of things. Do you try to go after that power play quarterback? So I think Zeev Buium is absolutely an option for them as well. Yes, he's not as big as some of the other defensemen, but at 6 foot with the puck moving capabilities that he has, he could really move the needle for that team in a way that few others can. So I think that Zeev is absolutely in the mix for that team. So I'm giving you a lot of different options. You'll have to stay tuned for my final mock draft, which will be coming out soon, as I narrow things down and try to find out what exactly we are going to see from the Utah Hockey Club next week. All right. Our next one goes to Easy Ev, and this is Blackhawks related. He goes, has anything changed on who the Hawks may prefer? Are you hearing the love of Demidov too? Well, the Blackhawks did meet with Ivan Demidov. I believe they shared a meal with him in Florida. They did, continue to do their due diligence. I think that he's still in the mix, but, I still feel that Chicago is more than likely going to go with Artem Levshinov. That seems to be what the, sources around the league believe. And really at the end, if you believe that Artem Levshinov is a number 1 defenseman, you would take the number one defenseman over the number one wing. They're going to play more. They're going to impact the game in a different way. They might not score as much. They're definitely not going to score as much, but they're going to impact the game in a significant way. And I think that's what a lot of people believe Lev Shinov will do. I think he's been picked apart in the public more than he's been picked apart by the scouts in terms of, yes, there are defensive liability situations there. Sometimes he makes the wrong decision with the puck. More often than not, he impacts the game in a positive way and plays massive minutes and gives you a lot. Not only that, but he's close to 6'2", just shy of 6'2". So, closer on the average size of NHL defenseman, but at the same time, very physically strong, physical, a guy that will engage. And then he has that mobility on top of it. So I really do think that's it. And that brings us to our next question, which comes from Zach. And Zach asks, what's the likelihood Artem Levshinov becomes a number one or a top pairing defenseman? What I've said repeatedly on this podcast, and I apologize for repeating myself for everybody else, but I do think that it's, I've seen the narrative about this guy, and the likelihood of any player becoming a number one defenseman in the NHL is low, because there are 32 of those jobs in the league. And what I've said many times is that of the defensemen in this draft class, I feel like Ivan Demidov has the best chance to be a number one defenseman in the NHL. The mobility, the size, the capability with the puck, the offensive sense, the skating stride, the north-south speed, the ability to absorb pressure, the poise with the puck. I mean, there's so many things that he does that are of the exceptional variety. And really the only thing, we'd be talking about him in such a different way if he wasn't in the same draft class as Zeev Buium on the points front. And you can make an argument that Zeev Buium belongs in that discussion as well, as the guy, if he's going to be like a Makar or a Hughes or a Fox. And I don't necessarily know that I see, I watched all those players. I don't think that Zeev is going to quite get there, but I think he's in the conversation. But what if we're talking about Levshinov and he's in this Heiskanen conversation, or like a Drew Doughty or something of that nature? I think he's going to play major minutes. I think he's going to give you effective shifts. He's going to play effective games. I think he will more than likely sign. So you get him into your system, you get him in the AHL earlier, potentially. I do think that'll, I'm not 100% positive that he won't go back to Michigan State, but the way he's talked about school, I don't necessarily know if he loved the academic side of things, and might want to just be hockey full time. But he's a really interesting player. And I do feel, of the defensemen in this class, he is the most likely to be a number one defenseman. And that's why I have him as my top defenseman in the class. All right. Next question comes from Greg. Greg asks, where does Katon rank among Matt Savoy and Zach Benson? All of them seem like similar players with skill, skating. Sabres could be caught between a rock and a hard place if he is still on the board. Probably best player available, but similar players. Absolutely similar players. If you're asking me where I would have ranked Berkly Catton alongside Matt Savoy and Zach Benson in their same draft year, well, if you look at my rankings, I have Berkly Catton number 5 on my list. I think very, very highly of the player. He has outproduced Matt Savoy in the WHL by a significant margin in his draft season, and also in Savoy's draft +1, draft +2 seasons. And so that is, interesting. I think that's part of it. Zach Benson, same thing. Katon has more points. I think the other thing that you have with Benson is the wing versus center debate. But again, we're talking about very similar size players, and I think you're exactly right. So to me, Katon is ahead of both of those players as a prospect. I feel that more comfortable projecting him as a number 2 center with the ability to produce at a high level. But you've got Savoy, you've got Benson, similar size players, similar skill sets. And yes, they might be between a rock and a hard place, and Katon might be the best pick there. I think that if you do pick him, it might make a player like Savoy expendable. His value would not be particularly high, I don't think, among NHL teams, even though he was a very good junior player. I just don't think that that's necessarily going to move the needle for enough teams to do that. But we look at what he did this season, as a dominant junior player. I mean, we expect that of a 20-year-old player to dominate the way that he did. But I think if Catton is on the board, and one of those right shot defensemen are there, you might lean towards the right shot defenseman. But I think Catton is probably the most impactful pick you can make in the range that the Sabres are in, and then you deal with everything else later. You can't, I don't think, have all three of those players in your system. You can't have that plus no Östlund plus some of these other players. You have to find balance, and it's just the way the draft board has fallen that you don't have it. So we'll see where that goes. But very interesting question, and I like the format of that. All right, we go to our Sens armchair GM, and he asks, will Iggy Jr. make it to pick 7? Will Teagan make it to pick 7? I think he will. I haven't gotten tremendous intel that he'll go any sooner than that. So I think that he's probably going to be available at 7. The question is does that fit what Ottawa needs? I don't think he's going to be a center. I've said that many times. I think he's a tremendous goal scorer. I think he's got a lot to give on both sides of the puck. I like the way that he plays the game. And yes, I think he'll be there. So to answer your question, yes, I think he'll be there. Should the Sens take him? It really depends on who else is on the board. All right, our next question comes from Nestor, and Nestor asks, is Beckett Seneca a legit top 10 prospect? I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I think that in the eyes of a lot of NHL scouts, he is, because of the tremendous upside. They know there's a bit of a risk factor with him. You're getting a player that's still growing, that's still figuring out how to use that frame of his, a guy that has this skill, that has good skating ability, a guy that really drove a team and helped drive a team into a tremendous postseason run in the OHL. And I think there are a number of teams out there that believe that he is among the top forwards in this draft because of that. I think you look at guys like Lindstrom and the injury situation, Demidov and the Russian factor, and Katon with his size. Those are the types of players that you're debating between. And then it's also the defenseman. If you feel that Beckett Seneca has a chance to be a top line scoring wing, but you're looking at it, if any of the other defensemen are maybe top forwards at the top pairing, you might lean towards the top scoring wing. But I do think that he is a legitimate top prospect in the eyes of the NHL scouts that I talked to. He's just outside of my own list, and I think is in a really good spot there. All right, let's get a Red Wings question here. This one comes from Senor Hundo. Senor Hundo asks, is Detroit really going to select Michael Brandsegg-Nygaard? Well, he's certainly been mock drafted there an awful lot. I think that if it just really depends. And the reason that you'll see Nygaard there a lot, Brandsegg-Nygaard there a lot, isn't necessarily because, yes, he does fit their type. You look at Nate Danielson, you look at Marco Kasper, you say, okay, well, this guy plays a lot like those guys, and that'll make us a little more hard-nosed. I think Michael Brandsegg-Nygaard, it should also be noted, is a really good goal scorer. He's not necessarily the natural scorer like a Cole Yzerman or a Teagan, but he has a great shot. He gets into the interior. He's got a quick release. He can score from distance, and he can score in tight. And I think he gives you a lot of other value as well. He's not as exciting as some of those more skilled players like a Berkly Catton and others. But, what happens if he's there? And I think, to me, we don't know what Steve Yzerman is going to do. We don't know. I mean, I think at some point they're going to have to start looking for some of those more home run swing type players as opposed to the safer, high floor players that he's kind of gone after in these last couple of years. And Marco Kasper and Nate Danielson both had so seasons. So, you kind of look at that and say, all right, well, what are we going to do? I think he makes sense for them, but I don't think it's a guarantee that he's the pick for them. So it's just a mock draft. Anything can happen. Just takes one pick to change it all. So we'll see where it goes. All right. Our next question comes from Hockey Night. Hockey Night asks, we had no night one trades last year. Do you think teams will be more frisky? I do. I think that there's a real potential for more trades. I think the rising salary cap creates a little bit more flexibility. I think that there's a little bit more known out there. I think that the bottom half of the first round has a lot of players that teams like, but maybe don't feel like they're going to be able to get there in the second round. We have a lot of teams with multiple second round picks, which are teams that are ripe to move up for the right player. That creates a great value opportunity for teams that are picking lower in the draft that might not have a lot of prospect needs or have a more shallow prospect system and would like to kind of scatter shoot it a little bit with second round prospects. So I do think that we will see a fair amount of movement. I don't know if it'll be player, hockey trades as they're called often, where we're seeing a lot of roster players moved unless it's for one of those premium draft picks. But I do think we could see some up and down movement, especially at the end of the first round when there's going to be a lot of knowns after picks are made. Teams will start making those calls. All right, now we're getting into the Rutger McGroarty portion of the podcast, part 2, as this first question comes from MS. What pick would make you consider swapping for Rutger McGroarty, i.e. 5th overall onwards, later? Curious where he would slot in versus this draft class for you. So that is a great question. And the fact of the matter is, I said at the top, I think that if the Jets do trade McGroarty, it is unlikely they would get anything in that top 15 to get to move into him. I just don't think, yes, he's closer to NHL ready. Yes, he's a bit more of a known commodity, but he is still a player that's yet, below average skating, was injured this season. And while he had a substantial uptick in production, there's certainly going to still be questions about his overall translatability. I love the player. I think he's going to be an NHLer. I think he could potentially wear a letter at some point in the NHL. I think that matters, but the question is will other teams believe that? And that's what the Jets are going to have to try to find out. I think it's more likely that we see him, if he's going to be moved, it's going to be anywhere from 15 to 25 in terms of those prospects. Like, if you're the Boston Bruins, you just got the 25th overall pick. Rutger McGroarty might fit what you're building more than what that 25th overall pick will do for you. Will that be enough for the Jets to move the pick? I don't know. Probably not. But at the same time, I think if I'm the Jets, I got to hold out and get as much value as I possibly can. Maybe it's a prospect for prospect swap. Maybe it is a draft pick. Maybe it's a collection of draft picks. But either way, I don't think, if I'm a Jets fan, I don't anticipate them getting fair value versus, a 14th overall pick. The top 14 of this draft is highly regarded, and I don't think that Rutger would have necessarily fit into it if he were in this draft class. So that's what you have to consider there. All right. Also, a little bit more for McGroarty. Avco Cup, which of the top 20 prospects in this year's draft do you think would be a fair trade for teams in exchange for Rutger McGroarty? So as I look at that, I think about the guys that will be available in that 15 to 20 range and the different players that, you could potentially see in that range. And, I think you look at those guys like Michael Hage, Sasha Boisvert, Jet Luchenko, players like that. I think that there is a chance that you can make those picks and that would be, a fair trade for that player. I think beyond those guys, you're hoping that you get some good value out of it. But I think in that 15 to 20 range, there's going to be some guys that really do fit in that mix. I think Igor Chernyshov, a number of players like that. I like Rutger McGroarty a lot, but I just think it's very tough for a team to get good value in the situation that they're in. Which brings me to another question, and one I was very much looking forward to answering. It's going to cause me to take a sip of coffee first because I need to make sure I have all my energy for this one. All right. This one comes from Rob, and Rob asks, are NCAA players going to drop due to a perception of signing risk? It seems as real as the Russian factor. Well, I did see this put into the public about Rutger McGroarty. And yes, there's Rutger McGroarty. There's Cutter Gauthier. There's a number of players that waited things out. Kevin Hayes is a player that waited 4 years and let his draft rights lapse and became a free agent. There are a number of other guys that were drafted later and became a free agent. What I will say is that both in the Cutter Gauthier situation and in the Rutger McGroarty situation, the teams could have potentially avoided this situation. What they chose not to do was sign the player at the end of their sophomore college season, or in Gauthier's case, his freshman season. It created, a situation where the player wasn't happy with that decision, didn't see a path forward in that organization, had a different timeline than the organization did. And sometimes that's can be reconciled. Other times it's not. You have players in the case of like guys like Jimmy Vesey and players that let their draft rights lapse and become free agents. I think in a lot of those cases, those players will never have that same opportunity again. And so it's a leverage that they use. I do think that Canadian teams in particular are going to start being a bit more wary of taking American players. I say that knowing full well that the Canucks have Quinn Hughes and Brock Besser and JT Miller. The Maple Leafs have Austin Matthews, Jake McCabe, Matt Nyes, like different players that are helpful to them. The Habs have Cole Caulfield, but I think teams like Winnipeg in particular, Edmonton, Calgary, it's going to be harder for them to land those American prospects. And I think that we could see that correct. And the interesting thing is that Winnipeg had such a good track record with Americans for a long time. But I think the thing is the fear is you're going to have that guy for 7 years, or you have a situation like McGroarty where that's the thing. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of players that are drafted on the college track, the vast majority of players are going to sign with the team that drafted them. These are unique cases. There's a lot more moving parts to it. There's a lot of things that happen. I don't think that, teams don't have to like it. I don't always like it either. But I also think that I've always felt that one of the things that the NHL has allowed is an opportunity for players, particularly the players in the college track, to have a fair amount of leverage. There's a reason that teams are wanting or that agents are presenting shortening the draft, because the reason that they want to shorten the draft is they don't want to have a pool of players that don't get to make choices about their future. If we shorten the draft to 4 rounds, there would be a much larger pool of undrafted free agents, and those players then have the opportunity to pick where they go, as opposed to be forced into a team draft rights and have their draft rights held for 4 years. So it's a complicated process. It is something, but I don't think teams are going to materially change the way that they draft because of that. I do think that teams, like, the thing is that the old Russian factor was there was also a high bust rate among those players, not just that they didn't come over, it's just that they didn't pan out. So that was the other thing. A lot of these college players, they are panning out, which is the issue, where they pan out so well that they have other opportunities. So I don't think that NHL teams, maybe a few, but like I said, like maybe the Canadian teams will be a little bit more wary of college players, but I don't think it's going to be a significant difference. All right, let's go to our next question. It comes from Trevor, and he asks, what do you think about the value of the Preds' 3 second-rounders? Do you think they will be enough talent left in the late 50s where they would make all 3 picks, or should they package some of them and move up? It's a really good question. I think with Barry Trotz at the helm, anything is possible. He has said he wants to get better. He wants to get more players. He wants to get more aggressive. And I think if you are a team like Nashville, where you're sub 50 pick, you're after picks 50, I think, the opportunity to get a guy that you like, maybe packaging 2 of those to move up. I wouldn't want to package all 3 unless there is a player you're absolutely desperate to draft. The thing is that, with the picks being where they are, the likelihood of them landing an everyday NHL player is like 10% or something like that. Excuse me. And so you increase your chances by moving up. The Chicago Blackhawks already moved up just to get up both their first round pick and their second round pick a little bit higher, because they felt the value was higher in that around 50. So if I'm the Nashville Predators, I'm seriously considering my options. I'm going to wait and see what's on the board. I'm going to see if one of the players we desperately want is there and that we feel strongly that they need to go and get that player. It's not always an easy situation. It's not always easy to trade up, but I think there are a lot of teams that are more receptive to it than I've ever been before. You wonder if maybe you're able to sneak one of the Pittsburgh Penguins 2 first-round picks and say, hey, we want to get that 46th pick or the 44th pick and what it's going to take to get up there. That's a team that might be willing to do it. So you have to weigh that. But I think having more picks in the second round when you go into the draft is a great opportunity for your team to give you way more options, because the second round is still a round where you are going to find players that are going to play for you and guys that you're going to sign to contracts. You have to get those picks right. But if you have a chance to get a guy that you really like, then you do consider packaging those picks to move up. All right, we're getting a little bit further down the draft board now, which I like, because we talk a lot about the top 10 all year. We talk about the top 30, but let's talk about day 2 a little bit more, as this one comes from Patrick. He goes, where's Swanson going and why? He's talking about Max Swanson from the Fargo Force, the MVP of the Clark Cup playoffs, and a tremendous USHL career for Max Swanson. He was number 100 on our top 100 prospects for the NHL draft list, and I can almost guarantee you he is going to go a lot lower than that. Why? It is because of the size factor. The reason that I believe that Max Swanson should be drafted, and the reason I put him on my list, is I've seen the work ethic, I've seen the way that he plays, I've seen the fact that he's been a winner, that he had one of the better U16 or U17 seasons in the USHL, one of the youngest players ever to play at the World Junior A Challenge, which is typically reserved for more senior players in the USHL. The fact that he was able to make that team make an impact, played well at the Lincoln Gretzky Cup, played really well throughout the season with Fargo, and helped them become one of the best teams in the USHL ever this season. But I still think the fact that he's 5'7" is going to curtail the vast majority of NHL teams from taking him. I think that it's more than likely than not he would not go. I don't think he'll go before the 5th round. I think it's more likely he's in the 6th or 7th round. I think there are teams that have seen him enough to say we want to take a chance on him. Just at his size, it's going to be very difficult. He's not as dynamic. You think about the different smaller players at the USHL level that did make it. Johnny Gaudreau is example number 1. Not a big guy, otherworldly skill. He had NHL skill. I don't think you can say that definitively about Max Swanson. What I do think is that if he doesn't get picked, he's going to have an opportunity to go to the University of North Dakota, make an immediate impact there, maybe get drafted next year, or he goes through and becomes a free agent and someday, forces a team to sign him. I think that's absolutely possible for Max Swanson. So really like the player. I think he deserves to be picked. I just think it'll be very late. All right, next one comes from Steve. And Steve asks, please give us a few deep sleepers that will go in the 80 to 120 range. Thanks, Chris. Well, I don't know if they're necessarily deep sleepers, but I think in that range you certainly could. One of the guys that's towards the end of my list on my top 100 that I've been using as one of my favorite sleepers for this draft, because I think he's going to go well after where I put him on the board, is Dubuque Fighting Saints defenseman Una Väisänen. And watched him a lot this year, watched Dubuque have a great season, thought he was excellent in the playoffs, thought he was a very tough defenseman to match up against for any team that played him. Matt Vigridin, when we were at the Combine, shouted him out as one of the toughest players to play against in the USHL. He's a re-entry. He played on the Finnish under 20 team at the World Juniors this year. Not a huge offensive producer, but he did have a good season on that front in the USHL. I don't think he's going to be a major offensive producer in the NHL. But Una Väisänen, I mean, this is a guy that he just plays a simple, predictable game, and it's the kind of game that gets you a career. I think that he's a stopper. He is highly intelligent, and I think he's going to be an impactful player going forward in his career. He's not the biggest guy, but he is, about 6 foot. And I just think that he is a guy that just plays the game the right way. And then I think that's going to resonate with teams. And I think somebody will take him in the middle range of the draft. You look at some of the other guys that I think will go a bit later. Miguel Marquez, he's been high on central scouting lists. I don't think that's necessarily shared in the NHL industry. Could be a 4th rounder. I think that there's a lot of intrigue there. Kevin He, another guy who just has really great skill. I think there's some in and out compete, and that's, he wasn't on my list as a result of that. I think that he has a chance to go in that range and be really, really solid. Another guy that I have on my list, top 100, Heikki Ruohonen, who I think is going to be a mid-round pick. Plays the game hard. He's going to the Dubuque Fighting Saints next year. So we'll see him in the USHL. I think those are guys that are going to find a way to make an impact in this league, and then, find a way to potentially make it as draft picks. But I think those guys are there. You also look, there's a lot of reentries, and I think that that's really at this stage, you look for those types of players, guys that, maybe have a chance to be picked. Does this finally the year for Jake Livanavage, who was not picked 2 years out of the Chicago Steel, but had a really good season at North Dakota this year, made the World Junior Camp, had an opportunity to play on that team. Didn't ultimately make it, but was very much in the mix for a considerable amount of time. Patrick Geary at Michigan State, he played alongside Artem Levshinov and Maxime Sturbach and all those guys. And so a lot of scouts were out there. He also made the World Junior Camp and was, in the mix for that. More of a defensive defenseman. Does he get an opportunity? So there's a lot of different players like that that are fascinating. One other name to keep an eye on for the draft is Austin Bernovic from the Madison Capitals in the USHL. He had a 40-goal season this year after playing at the NTDP and really kind of being under the radar. That's another guy that I think, mid-rounds, late bloomer. Let's see where it goes in college for him. But he has size, he had scoring ability, tremendous season for Madison, and certainly a guy that I'd keep a close eye on. All right. Now we go to our next question from Robert. And Robert asks, which player is the best player that is available who was born, raised, and developed completely in a non-traditional hockey market? Well, developed completely is a tough one because I think a lot of kids end up having to move or choose to move away in their, 14U, 15U, whether they're going to prep schools or one of the big clubs. So it's harder and harder for kids to stay home. If there's a guy from a non-traditional area that I think is the best in this draft, it's Steve Buium, San Diego, California. I mean, this is a guy that played in Southern California up until he went to Shattuck St. Mary's. I believe he went there as a bantam, and then played up and went to the national team program. But before that, he's playing in California, and so I think there's a lot of people rooting for him. I think there are a number of teams that are on the West Coast that are picking high in the draft that I think would like to get their hands on him. But we'll have to wait and see how it all shakes out. But I think he's one of those guys that you certainly look at and with a lot of excitement. I don't know if this meets your criteria, Robert, for developed completely, but he did not leave home at like 4 years old to go to Michigan or anything. He did leave when it was time to go to prep school. So Steve Buium is the answer for me on that one. All right, next one comes from Jeremy, and he says, we always hear about how important the cute little dinner dates at the combine are, but sometimes it seems that like the reporting is that a player has gone out to dinner with half the league. The combine is only 6 days. How are all these players going to dinner with all these teams? Well, I don't think it's not common for a player to go out with like more than 3 teams. I think sometimes, it just kind of depends on the schedule. These are often set up between the teams, the agents. I think Central Scouting at least has a knowledge of who's going out there too, because it's their event, the combine. And, I think that there's there have been other options too. Like Arizona took a bunch of prospects out at the same time, to go and get a feel for them, and you kind of get a chance to see them interact with each other and other things like that. These dinners, I don't think have a huge impact on the ultimate decision to draft a player. I just think that it's more of let's get that final bit of information. And so, but the players have all that time, the 6 days, really, they have the interviews all day. Teams decide who they want to take out to dinner. They don't always do it. Not all the players get a chance to do it. But either way, it's just another piece of information. It's not a huge deal. I don't think it, but I think that the players that are, in a range where a lot of teams can pick them, guys like Sam Dickinson, Beckett Seneca, they'll want to get a feel for them. All right. Next question comes from Foulball15. At Foulball15. I hear so much draft analysis that emphasizes NHL team or prospect pool need.
Given how few prospects make it and how much NHL teams change season over season, do you think it's a fool's errand trying to draft for need? Not necessarily, because I think that when a team builds their board, they're thinking best player available, but they're also thinking about what is the fit. So team need is another way of saying fit sometimes, because teams are trying to build a roster. If you only draft centers, you're probably going to end up with a few wings in there. You're probably going to end up with a few things, but if you only draft one thing, you're probably missing some opportunities to help build your roster. So you look at the Buffalo Sabres, for example. They have so many left shot defensemen. They have needs throughout their system, but really you think about center, you think about right shot D, that just allows them to bring some balance. I think when you're picking higher in the draft, you can be pickier. You're right that most players aren't going to matriculate for a few years. And I think as you get further down the board, you just simply go straight off your list, but your list is made with what you need in mind. I think that's a really important thing to understand. Teams aren't making these lists in a vacuum. They are not saying this is the best player. They're saying this is the best player that fits what we do. This is the best player that fits what we need. This is the best player. So they're having those conversations. Some teams will even build kind of different lists where they kind of look at that need-based stuff. They look at the top, what is the value? How much more value are we going to generate with this player playing this position than this player playing that position? So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So the thing is like best player available. We're not just, teams are not just picking off of the Bob McKenzie list that's coming out this week. They're looking at it as a piece of information, but Bob's or mine or Corey Pronman's or Elite Prospects or whatever site you check your prospect stuff out are. What I've learned over the years is that my best player available does not match whoever is picking. And so there's really no way to know for sure if that player is really the best player available or if it was just the best player for that team. And I think in more cases than not, it's the latter. It's not just these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. So they have to build a team out. And some teams are less adherent to that than others, but I think that most teams feel that in order to build with balance, they have to make those decisions. So good question. I think it's often the big debate. Best player available, everybody's definition of that is different. So it's something to keep in mind. All right, our final question, and we have a celebrity questioner. This one comes from NHL.com's Mike Morial, and he asks, will Big Red make an appearance in Vegas? For those that don't know, when I travel for Flo Hockey, I often travel with the camera setup that I'm using right now to record my podcast and a microphone, a stick microphone to interview players. And on the end of that microphone is a bright red windscreen that has a big Flo F on it, the Flo Hawk as we like to call it. And it is it kind of looks like a punching bag. And I have been known at times to run into some of my fellow members of the media, like Mike Morial, with Big Red, as it's now affectionately known. So it is a rite of passage to be clocked by Big Red in a media scrum with me, because yes, I will get the elbows out. We are trying to get interviews, and you will see Big Red in our draft coverage, because we'll be using a lot of video. We will be interviewing prospects. We will be doing some video blogging. We will be doing some post-draft analysis. So yes, you will see Big Red. And if you are a listener of this podcast, you will know now that the microphone's name is Big Red and that it has maybe hit Mike Morial in the head 3 to 4 times in the last 2 years. So it's not my fault. Mike gets in the way sometimes. But Mike, if you guys don't know Mike, and you probably do because you listen to this podcast, Mike is one of the hardest working people I have ever met in this industry. He is one of the best storytellers for this draft. He cares so much about what he does, and nobody hustles harder than him. Mike Morial, NHL.com. Make sure you read his work in addition to ours, because Mike puts the work in, has great access, has great questions. I've learned a ton from him over the years. I have such respect for him. So I'm using this question opportunity to shout out one of the very best people in the business, Mike Morial. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. As I cough, I'm about to head into that dry heat of Vegas, and I'm ready to do it. Hopefully the cough goes away by then. But I cannot thank you guys enough for sticking around throughout the end of this podcast. I know it's a bit of a long one. We try to do our draft special every year. Want to give you guys the opportunity to get the questions in. So thanks if you asked a question. Thanks if you thought about asking questions. And thanks for following all of our work all year. It's the Super Bowl week as far as I'm concerned. The NHL draft is here. This is what our entire year builds up for. It is how we end the season on the highest possible note. I cannot wait to cover this draft. I think it's going to be one of the more unique experiences of my career going into the Sphere. And I really hope that you guys will enjoy coming along with us on this ride, because it has been a ride. San Jose Sharks, you are on the clock. All the rest of you, stay hydrated. Get ready for a very, very fun draft week. The next time I'll talk to you, it'll be from Las Vegas, Nevada. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Josh for producing. We will see you guys next week after the draft.